Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Language and Mediated Masculinities, Cultures, Contexts, Constraints, by Robert Lawson. Narrated by David Vries. Publisher's note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to figures and tables present in the print and ebook formats of the book. Preface. Before the main part of the book, there are a few things I'd like to get out of the way first, primarily to help explain some of the background to the book and the actual process of writing it. These issues aren't central to the main aims of the book, but I think they're important in terms of the context in which it was written. If you prefer, you can skip over this preface and I'll be none the wiser. But as I go on to note, both here and in the upcoming chapters, this book is a product of who I am and the life I've lived, and the process of writing it is not divorced from that reality. To that end, this preface will give listeners a better understanding of how this book came about and how it is situated within the broader structural context of academia. First, writing this book has been, without a shadow of a doubt, the single most difficult personal and intellectual endeavor I've ever undertaken. Not only did I write the vast majority of the book during a prolonged period away from my family and friends as a junior visiting professor at the University of Uvascula, a point I discuss in more detail later on, but there is also a profound pressure in coming up with new ideas, seeing things in different ways, and ultimately writing something that other people are hopefully going to find a valuable, interesting, and useful contribution to knowledge. And since I don't consider myself especially talented, innovative, or clever, it's been doubly awful, because I've had to contend with constantly comparing myself to the brilliant writing that I have had to read for this book, and having an acute case of imposter syndrome doesn't help with this. Theodore Roosevelt once opined that comparison is the thief of joy. Yet comparison looms large in academia, where ideas are currency, and setting yourself out as different is an occupational necessity. So, to anyone listening to this who thinks that writing a book is easy, please take it from me that it's anything but. On the other hand, I don't think I'm anything special, so if I can do it, then you definitely can do it too. One thing that kept me going through the long days, nights, and weekends of writing was something that my parents told me when I was growing up. As long as you try your best, then no one can ask any more of you. This book is absolutely the best that I could have done. I hope it's enough. Second, over the course of writing this book, the UK higher education sector was embroiled in strike action in November 2019, February 2020, December 2021, and again in November 2022, partly in response to planned changes to pensions and partly in response to increasing precarity, workplace stress, and the yawning gap between education as a commodity and education as a social good. The strikes were not one-issue campaigns, but rather responses to the culmination of years of underinvestment, overwork, and a series of increasingly unrealistic demands on staff. After years of mismanagement by governmental agencies and ministers who variously introduced a variety of innovations like the National Student Survey, the Teaching Excellence Framework, and other metrics, academics across the UK decided that they could no longer tolerate the slow erosion of the values and expertise that has made the UK higher education sector one of the best in the world. While there's an argument to be made that the innovations introduced by government agencies encourage a high-quality teaching environment, the other side of the argument is that they detract from the core university focus of teaching, research, and writing, leading to short-term thinking couched primarily in terms of league tables and rankings. Moreover, academics are increasingly squeezed on all sides, barely able to keep up with the demands of teaching, planning, preparation, committees, meetings, marking, tutorials, office hours, emails, outreach, and public engagement, never mind reviewing, writing, editing, collaborating, and dealing with other research-related activities. These constant pressures have an effect on staff morale, mental health, and well-being, sometimes culminating in devastating consequences. The suicide of Dr. Malcolm Anderson, a lecturer at Cardiff University in February 2018, is one such tragedy. And there are countless others struggling under unsustainable workloads, unrealistic targets, constant emails, and the difficulties of doing more with less, leading to significant increases in depression, anxiety, and general poor mental health across the sector. The COVID-19 pandemic further exacerbated long-standing pressures, alongside the emotional and psychological toll of lockdowns, quarantines, virus testing, and isolation from friends, family, and colleagues. Don't get me wrong, I'm incredibly privileged to have the job that I do. I love working with my students and helping them reach their goals. My colleagues, both at BCU and further afield, are wonderful educators and incredible researchers, and I am proud to work alongside them. I find research tough, but I get a fair amount of personal and professional satisfaction from seeing an idea through to final publication. I have reasonable job security, I'm able to take on projects that I believe in, and I think that what I do as a teacher, lecturer, and researcher is socially valuable and adds something to the world, however small that contribution might be. Unfortunately, I know of far too many exceptionally talented colleagues who do amazing and important teaching and research on precarious fractional contracts, who have to jump from job to job with no long-term security, and who are not able to plan for their futures. I also know of too many colleagues who, even with secure contracts, find it difficult to keep up with the range of competing demands placed upon them. Academia certainly isn't the only sector suffering from these issues, reproduced as they are in healthcare, policing, transport, primary and secondary education, social work, and many other professions. While it's difficult to ward off the temptation to argue about who's got it worse, it's important that people stand together and push for real change across all sectors rather than engage in a race to the bottom. All of this takes me to my third point, which concerns the junior visiting professor post I took at the University of Uvascula, or JYU. As I mentioned earlier, writing this book was far from easy, most particularly because I lived apart from my wife Rebecca and our daughter Bethany for the 6 months of my research leave in Finland. There were a few reasons for making this decision. First, it didn't seem like a great idea to uproot the entire family and move to a country where we didn't know anyone, didn't speak the language, didn't know our way around, and didn't know if we'd make it through the long, dark months of a Finnish winter. Second, we knew that without accepting the post, writing this book would have to happen in the small chunks of time I had between meetings, teaching, commuting, and my regular work responsibilities, alongside spending evenings and weekends trying to make progress, something which didn't really appeal to either of us. Deciding whether or not to the opportunity on offer from JYU was one of the most difficult decisions Rebecca and I have ever had to make together, especially since the longest we'd been apart from one another in nearly 10 years was just over a week. In terms of positives, the post would mean that I would have nearly 6 months to dedicate to the book, alongside the opportunity to share my research and build new connections with an academic community I hadn't previously had the chance to work with. In terms of negatives, it meant that Rebecca would have to take on 6 months of looking after our daughter by herself, a full-time job substantially tougher than what I had to deal with in Finland, while we would be apart as a family for the duration of my stay. The personal cost for all of us should be obvious at this point. I say all of this because it's easy to be critical of someone who has upped sticks to gallivant off to another country for research purposes. For example, in one of the few academic articles on acknowledgments, Kalachi observes that they offer a glimpse into the political economy of academic life, revealing truths that we intend to share as well as many that we do not. Kalachi goes on to wryly note that acknowledgments written by male scholars sometimes seem to blur the boundary between a genuine thank you letter and a heartfelt confessional, suggesting the following as a more accurate rendering of traditional acknowledgments. Dear reader, I exploited my wife's reproductive labor, neglected my children and aging parents, shifted departmental service onto my colleagues, extracted knowledge from people in a distant country, contributed to the warming of the planet by flying all over the world, and withdrew from my community, all in order to bring you this book. I read Kalachi's article about halfway through writing the book, and it has stayed with me ever since, especially because, at least in my case, there was more than the sting of truth in her argument. Support of my wife? Check. Leaving her to take on all the child-caring duties? Check. Spending time away from my daughter? Check. Leaving colleagues to take on my work responsibilities? Check. Traveling via airplane to a far-flung international locale? Check. Didn't see family or friends for months? Check. I fit, in quite a worrying way, it has to be said, what Kalachi calls, mostly tongue-in-cheek I think, the ideal scholar, one who is flexible, mobile, has a passport from a powerful nation, can rely on a partner for childcare, and is not providing for extended family or elderly, sick, or vulnerable parents. It is true that I have benefited enormously from the privilege of international mobility, the invitation of a research post at a prestigious international institution, and the support of my wife, who took on the individual responsibility of raising our daughter while working at a university which allowed me to take time away from my normal duties and having colleagues who could cover my responsibilities. While all of this is perhaps commonplace in academia, especially for male scholars, it nevertheless raises a number of issues concerning equality of opportunity, privilege, and reciprocity. I could, of course, overlook all of this and instead present the writing of this book as the neat, packaged-up story that we all know and love. And this is Kalachi's argument. Most people do exactly that, a process which simply erases the structural contexts and struggles within which academic work emerges. By confronting some of these issues, we can at least start to ask the question, as Kalachi does, was this book really worth it? And doing so requires us to deal with some of the less salutary aspects of academic life, and to consider some of the broader structural contexts of academia, which Kalachi's main thesis arguably overlooks. This ultimately takes me to my fourth and final point. I think it's something of an open secret to say that academia is a ridiculously competitive club. There is a constant need to be research active and to climb the greasy ladder of something called success. Ultimately, research outputs in the form of journal articles, books, edited volumes, chapters, and so on are worth something in the eyes of the academy and in the eyes of the institutions who employ you. In the precarious and shifting sands of higher education, publications influence promotions, confer status, and often determine job security. Failure to publish can raise questions about your performance, your competency, and your ability to conduct research, so the pressure is on to write. But how do you fit something as demanding as a book alongside all of the other responsibilities that one might have? Unfortunately, with great difficulty. While the earliest rumblings of this book go all the way back to 2013, I eventually started working on it in earnest during my research leave in late 2018, where I was able to complete rough drafts of every chapter by the time my sabbatical ended. From January 2019 to August 2019, I didn't have any time for the book at all, due to major structural changes at BCU, preparing for teaching new modules, plus a host of other day-to-day activities that I needed to do just to keep my head above water. From January 2014 until January 2020, I oversaw the entire English degree program as part of my job at BCU, so it was a very intense and student-focused role. In 2018, I also took the decision to limit the amount I worked at evenings and weekends in order to spend time with my family, rather than working the 50 or 60-hour weeks that I had been previously. So it wasn't until I arrived at JYU in August 2019 that I was able to make any significant headway on the book, where I had time to read, learn new methods, analyze data, and write almost every day, including weekends, for nearly 6 months straight. And it was time that I needed. To go back to the post at JYU, the question Rebecca and I kept returning to was a simple one. Could we afford to turn it down? Without taking the post, the likely publication of this book would have been closer to 2026. As it is, it's out in 2023, a full 3 years earlier, and hopefully much closer to the contemporary contexts I discuss in the different chapters. I am nevertheless conscious of the extra work that Rebecca took on to make the visit to Finland, and by extension the book, possible in the first place. FaceTime, Skype, and pictures helped with the loneliness we both felt, but it's never quite the same as being in the there and now. The guilt of being an absent husband and father, knowing that I was missing out on precious time with my daughter and my wife, is not an experience I'd ever like to go through again. But as Rebecca reminded me during one evening of soul-searching, opportunities like visiting professor posts, junior or otherwise, very rarely come along, and it would have been silly to have turned it down. I'd certainly be the first to acknowledge that my privilege made it possible for me to finish this book, but I think it's reasonable to say that this is only part of the story. To that end, I hope what I've covered in this preface has provided more of an insight into the personal and professional contexts within which this book has been written. This kind of openness is much needed in academia, even if it is scary to stick your head above the parapet. Chapter 1. Contexts, Cultures, and Constraints. Language and Mediated Masculinities in the 21st Century. Trump, Pussygate, and Contemporary Masculinities. In late 2016, The Washington Post released a video of presidential candidate Donald Trump and Access Hollywood host Billy Bush discussing women, dating, and relationships. Captured during a bus ride while both Trump and Bush's microphones were switched on, this conversation saw Trump brag about his fame, his wealth, and his attempts at having sex with a married woman, offering a candid insight into his views regarding his celebrity status, the construction of sexual privilege, and his objectification of women. As the bus stops, one moment in the conversation stands out, where Trump and Bush start talking about the host who is meeting them, Ariane Zucker, an actress and model best known for her role in the American soap opera Days of Our Lives. 1. Trump. Yeah, that's her with the gold. I better use some Tic Tacs just in case I start kissing her. You know I'm automatically attracted to beautiful... I just start kissing them. 5. It's like a magnet. Just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything. 10. Bush. Whatever you want. Trump. Grab them by the pussy. You can do anything. Bush. Yeah, those legs. All I can see is the legs. 15. Trump. It looks good. Bush. Come on, shorty. Trump. Oh, nice legs, huh? Bush. Get out of the way, honey. Oh, that's good legs. After identifying Zucker, Trump says that he should take some breath fresheners just in case he starts kissing her, before talking about how being a celebrity means that he can do anything he wants to women, even grab them by the pussy. Line 11. In the process of reducing Zucker to her physical appearance, lines 7 through 11, coupled with comments about grabbing and kissing, Trump and Bush appear to condone sexual assault, abuse, and groping, ignoring issues of mutual consent and appropriate professional conduct. See also Cameron 2020 for a more detailed discussion of this incident. The video, originally recorded in 2005 but released in the run-up to the second presidential debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, drew criticism from across the social and political spectrum. House Speaker Paul Ryan stated that women should be championed or revered, not objectified, while John Oliver, host of the late-night political satire show Last Week Tonight, called Trump one giant, salivating, dick-size referencing, pussy-grabbing warthog in a red power tie. On the other side of the pond, controversial public commentator Katie Hopkins argued that Trump is a very flawed human. Big deal. I'd rather be grabbed by the pussy than governed by one. In subsequent interviews, Trump defended his statement, arguing that it was locker room banter typical of the kind carried out by men in private settings, where they brag about their sexual activities and their sexual partners. But even this generated widespread disagreement, especially among athletes, coaches, and other sporting professionals. For example, NFL player Chris Conley tweeted, "Just for reference, I work in a locker room every day. That is not locker room talk." While NBA player Kendall Marshall announced, "PSA, sexual advances without consent is not locker room talk." The video not only reignited debates about sexual privilege, consent, and how men in positions of power exploit their status, it also raised broader questions about men and masculinities in the 21st century, captured most prominently in ex-boxer Floyd Mayweather's defense of Trump, who argued that Trump speak like a real man spoke. Real men speak like, "Man, she had a fat ass. You see her ass? I had to squeeze her ass." Did the video really represent how men talk to one another in private? Were Trump and Bush men simply guilty of being men? And how did their conversation map on to cultural expectations surrounding white masculinity in contemporary Western societies? These questions once again came to the fore less than a year later during the #MeToo movement, a social media campaign which sought to highlight the sexual abuse and harassment faced by women from all walks of life, including politics, academia, and the media and entertainment industries. Men and masculinities in the public eye. We have seen an increase in Western media coverage about bad men in recent years, with social commentators, politicians, and journalists critiquing, challenging, or contesting toxic masculinity, the age of aggressive masculinity, and the problem of men. A cursory look at the discourses of and about men, particularly white heterosexual men, the focus of this book, would suggest that they play a major role in almost every contemporary social problem, from climate change to the global financial crash, from wars and civil conflicts to inner-city crime, and from interpersonal domestic violence to mass shootings. And there is arguably some truth in this. For example, all of the mass shootings in the U.S. between 2000 and 2018 were carried out by men, many very often preceded by a history of domestic abuse and misogyny. Internationally, most violent crime is carried out by men, including attempted murder, rape, sexual assault, robbery, and terrorist offenses. Most institutional and workplace sexism is carried out by men. Most instances of domestic violence and assault are perpetrated by men. Those responsible for the global economic turndown and the subsequent financial scandals which followed, including the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers Investment Bank in 2008, the renationalization of the Royal Bank of Scotland in 2009, the Lieber case in 2012, the J.P. Morgan Chase trading loss in 2014, the HBOS fraud case in 2016, and the HSBC tax evasion and money laundering scheme in 2017 were almost exclusively men. And male CEOs have been jailed for a variety of offenses over the years, such as tax evasion, securities fraud, theft, insider trading, investment mis-selling, and environmental crimes. Alongside these problems, boys and men tend to be disproportionately represented across a variety of other social ills. For example, British boys perform worse academically than girls. In almost every country, men are more at risk of committing self-harm and suicide. Men are more likely to suffer from drug, gambling, or alcohol addiction. Men have higher incarceration rates compared to women. Men are more likely to be the victim of violent crime, particularly in areas of high deprivation. Men take more risks in sex, driving, sports, outdoor pursuits, and a range of other activities. Men are less likely to seek out help for depression, anxiety, and stress. Men from socially disadvantaged backgrounds have poorer health outcomes in terms of disability, chronic illness, and injury rates compared to women in the same contexts. And men have a shorter life expectancy than women. Of course, whether these statistics are due to biological or sociological factors is an open question. Do men have a shorter life expectancy than women because they have a biological predisposition to higher cholesterol levels, for example, or is it because they pursue riskier behaviors which are likely to lead to an earlier death? Do men pursue these risky behaviors because competition and bravado are so ingrained as part of the masculine ideal? Do boys perform academically poorer than girls because being clever is seen as less manly? Or are there neurological differences which explain this patterning? I return to some of these points in Chapter 2, but for the moment, it is enough to say that this division between biological and sociological explanations of gendered behavior has dominated the research literature for decades. Changing masculinities? Going beyond the statistics we've just discussed, it would be reasonable to say that the traditional touchstones of male identity, such as aggression and risk-taking, are becoming increasingly problematized, challenged, or disputed, although these cultural touchstones also vary depending on age, social class, and background. This is not new, though. Men's lives have long been changing, from the loss of traditional laboring jobs from the mid-1970s onward, and the subsequent rise of technical and non-manufacturing specialisms, through to the shift in sexual relations and changing familial and domestic patterns which de-emphasize the role of the traditional male breadwinner. Even as far back as 1987, Shepherd Bliss, a key figure in the mythopoetic men's movement, claimed that the consensus about what it means to be a man in America today is eroding, a development that some applaud and others bemoan. In the mid-1980s through to the late 1990s, these men's movements, organizations, and consciousness-raising groups, influenced by writers like Robert Bly and Michael Meade, called for a return to a form of primal masculinity more connected to nature and spiritualism, drawing on storytelling, rituals, poetry, sports, and crafts. Such groups gave men the opportunity to gather together for friendship and connection, and to reflect on the supposed changes that were affecting their lives. That said, the men's movement as a whole was firmly entrenched in the crisis of masculinity discourse, where the shifting sands of contemporary gender relations seemingly left men without a place in the world. Even though the men's movement more or less stalled in the late 1990s, it is of course worthwhile questioning the contention that men were, or are, in crisis, given the abundant social capital that is usually afforded to them. While a common refrain, it is difficult to sustain any argument that places men, especially white men, in a victim position, even if many do not feel they benefit from any degree of social privilege. I return to these issues in later chapters. As author John Scalzi points out in one of his blog posts, in the role-playing game known as The Real World, straight white male is the lowest difficulty setting there is, and it is difficult to argue the contrary. Nevertheless, this crisis of masculinity discourse, which tends to center on white Western masculinities, is a beguiling one, and one that still crops up in contemporary discussions about men and their position in society. Drawing on this discourse, a variety of groups have pushed back against what they consider to be the ongoing demonization and marginalization of men who feel they are shunted to the sidelines. These groups include radical men's rights organizations, the newly coined, predominantly male-led political alt-right movement, online seduction communities, individuals who identify as involuntary celibates or incels, that is, men who, despite wanting to, have never had sex and have not been in a sexual relationship with another person, and advocates of men going their own way, conventionally known as the MGTOW movement, that is, men who reject marriage, common law partnership.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?